Can you hear me now? Lights on. Hello? It's on now.
Are you ready for your water?
Yes.
Ready to go?
Yes.
Okay, so previously on Ruth, right? So we begin with a famine that's ravaging through the land of Judah, and we then get a family, right? We've got Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two children, sick and frail. So because of the famine, they decide that they're going to leave Judah and travel all the way to Moab. So there they are in Bethlehem, and they make the trek all the way to the east to Moab. It would be about 50 to 60 miles. So Dallas to downtown Weatherford is about 60 plus, so maybe a little less than that. With the family in tow, it could take them a week. It's hard to tell. And while they're in Moab, Weak and Frail get married, Elimelech dies, and then Weak and Frail also die. So Naomi is then stuck with her two daughter-in-laws. And she then tells her daughter-in-laws that they need to go back, that she's been cursed by God, and they're cursed as well. And if they know what's good for them, they're not going to stick around with her. So they plead with her, and ultimately Orpah leaves and Ruth stays. And then we get Ruth's famous declaration, "Do not persuade me to leave you or go back and not follow you, for wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May Yahweh punish me and do so severely if anything but death separates you from me," which is, as I mentioned last time, one of the greatest declarations of faith in the Bible. So Naomi and Ruth head back. They come to Bethlehem, where Naomi is greeted by the women of the village, and she famously says, "Oh, look, Naomi's back." And she says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty," right, the Almighty El Shaddai, "has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord Yahweh has pronounced judgment on me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" And this is one of the harshest indictments we have against Yahweh directly in the Old Testament. But chapter 1 ends with, they arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so we start chapter 2. So before we begin, we have a word of the day. And the word of the day is serendipity. Serendipity is a great word. And it's an old word, but it didn't become very popular until about 100 years ago. And you can see it every so often in literature and movies and such. Serendipity, serendipitous. And it's the idea that you have a bunch of disconnected things, events, that are just all floating around in the ether, and yet they all miraculously manage to coincide in a way that something significant happens, and usually of benefit for a particular individual. And this is obviously relevant to the book of Ruth, where a bunch of seemingly individual occurrences, things that shouldn't be connected, are going to fall into place, as if by random chance, right? So we begin with one of these seemingly unrelevant occurrences. And it begins in verse 1 with what's known in Hebrew as a disjunctive clause. I'm not going to go into Hebrew grammar too much, but in narrative, sentences are connected to each other, so you have this kind of running string of actions. But every so often, you have a sentence that breaks the pattern, it breaks the chain, and it's just this sort of non sequitur, standalone piece of information. And here we begin with one such statement, and that is, now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side named Boaz. As if This may or may not be relevant for the story, just something that you, the reader, you, the observer, you, the audience, should happen to be aware of. As we talked about last week, the names of the characters seem to have some significance. Elimelech means my God is king, which seems to be a fairly pious name, although he ends up dying. You have both of the kids have pretty pathetic names, and they end up dying. And then you have Naomi, whose name means pleasant, but then she's become bitter, and she doesn't want to be called Naomi anymore. Boaz's name traditionally has been interpreted as strength, although there are some that dispute that. It's hard to know exactly. Now, the rest of the statement about Boaz, however, is that he was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family. So it's not just that he's a relative, but that he is connected directly to Elimelech. And it's this phrase, right, this statement here, a prominent man of noble character. That's how the Holman renders it. And there's really not a single translation that does this phrase justice. They all dance around it. You can see pattern sort of emerge, but they're not really giving you the full picture of how he's being described. And it's because they don't really know what to do with it. So the ESV, for example, has him as a worthy man. Okay? The NIV says a man of standing. The King James very famously calls him a mighty man of wealth, which is a little odd. You've got a wealthy and influential man, a man of great wealth, a wealthy prominent man, a prominent rich man, and a prominent man of noble character, as the Holman has it. Block, in his commentary, says that in its simplest sense, the expression means a man of substance. And I believe, in my humble opinion, he is 100% wrong. He wants to justify this idea. The problem is, and why I think he's wrong, is he cannot give a single example to justify his opinion on this phrase. I think he's wrong. We have here a subversion. But what does that mean? Okay, so the phrase that the Old Testament uses, simply enough, is Gibor Hayil. Now, the word Hayil should ring a bell from 2 weeks ago. Hayil means virtue. And the word Hayil, just like the word virtue in our use, can be used in different ways to describe different types of people. So you can call a soldier Hayil, and you can call a lawyer Hayil, you can call a judge Hayil, and it means different things. If we say that a soldier is virtuous, we usually refer to courage or bravery. If we're talking about a lawyer, we might mean honesty. If we're talking about a judge, if we say the judge is virtuous or noble, we don't necessarily mean brave or honest. We usually mean he's impartial, right? He's fair. Now, however, here he's not just described as a Hayil or an Ish Hayil, a man of virtue, or a man of character, a man of quality. He calls him a Gibor Hayil. What's a Gibor? Gibor is a warrior. It's a soldier. So this is a Gibor, a warrior of virtue. This is the phrase that is used of individual champions, such as Gideon. This is the phrase that the angel uses, or we can just say Jesus. When Jesus sees him and he's cowering in the wine vat, he goes, "Oh, you Gibor Hayil." Mighty warrior, that's how he calls him. This is the phrase that's used in Judges of Jephthah. This is what's used of Kish, Saul's father. And this is what's used of David when he's first introduced. And they're like, "Oh, we need some champion." And someone goes, "Oh, I know one." And he mentions David. However, it's also used to describe groups, as in the elite fighting forces. So we have this to describe Joshua's elite troops, as well as Saul's elite troops. It seems like every time this phrase is ever used, it's describing a warrior. And not just a warrior, a great warrior. So, what does it mean when it introduces us to Boaz as a Gibor Hayil? And this is where the translations and the commentaries all lose their minds. Because are we to assume that he's a great warrior? Maybe he's in retirement. Maybe he was a great warrior, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems to be this is how he is currently described. So what do? Well, they go, well, obviously this phrase doesn't mean mighty warrior, even though that's how it's used every other time in the Bible. This must mean something else, and it can be applied to soldiers. And that's where Bloch's reasoning comes in. I think he's wrong. I think that this is an expression to refer to warriors, to refer to champions, to refer to great heroes. And here we have a subversion. That's where that comes in. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have here a situation very similar to what we see in the Judges, where we have the Judges cycle, right? There's a problem. There's some sort of crisis that's introduced. There's a villain that's thrown into the narrative. Israel cries for help. God raises a hero. The hero then defeats the crisis, defeats the villain, and then Israel's restored to peace. Here, in this story of Ruth, we have a crisis. A great injustice has occurred in the land, to the point where God needs to raise up a hero. And what is that injustice? I'm assuming you all know the book of Ruth. A widow is being mistreated, and God takes this very seriously. And as I said last time, I tried to hammer the point. I'll continue to hammer the point. This book is not about Ruth. This is about Naomi. Naomi, who was forced out of her home because of the famine. She lost her husband, she lost her 2 sons, and now she's stuck taking care of this foreign young woman that she doesn't know what to do with, that she didn't want. She told her to leave, but she's followed her like a puppy dog. And she is bitter. She's mad at Yahweh, she's mad at the world, she's mad at whatever, and God is going to rectify this. And how does he do it? By raising up a champion. And I know it's been said, I know it's been beaten into the ground, but not all heroes wear capes. Not all heroes carry swords. And here we're introduced to a hero who doesn't carry a sword. He's just a farmer. And he's introduced as a great warrior because he is going to do what the judges are supposed to do, which is rectify the situation, solve the injustice. So, back at the plot. In verse 2, Ruth the Moabitess, it's always a fun word to say, asked Naomi, "Will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone who allows me to?" So this requires a fair amount of context. There's something called the Ten Commandments. I assume you're familiar with them. And I tried to talk about this a couple weeks ago during a Wednesday night. I'm of the opinion, I've been more or less convinced, that you can use the Ten Commandments to structure the legal stipulations of Deuteronomy. It actually works pretty well. And in chapter 15, so you can have, for example, a whole section on the exaltation of Yahweh, you have a section on proper worship, you have sections on cultic behavior, you have sections on ritual acts of remembrance, subjection to authority, and then laws on violence, purity, property, and so on. In chapter 15, which is right in the sabbatical laws, which coincides with respecting the Sabbath, almost like it was structured that way, you have this gem. "There will be no poor among you. However, because the Lord is certain to bless you in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess as an inheritance, if only you obey the Lord your God and are careful to follow every one of these commands I am giving you today. When the Lord your God blesses you as he has promised you, you will lend to many nations but not borrow. You will rule over many nations. They will not rule over you. If there is a poor person among you," so we were just told there aren't going to be, but if there is, "one of your brothers within any of your gates in the land the Lord your God is giving you, you must not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother. Instead, you are to open your hand to him and freely loan him enough for whatever he has need." So, there's no poor. There's not allowed to be any poor. But in the case that there might be poor, you got to take care of them. So then, in chapter 24, which coincides with the coveting laws, you have this interesting statement. "Do not deny justice to the foreigner or fatherless child, and do not take a widow's garment as security. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this." Okay, so there's no poor, and if there is poor, you have to take care of them, and you can't withhold anything from the poor or from the foreigner. So these are all connected. So in Leviticus, particularly in chapter 19, we have the law of gleanings. We also have laws relating to the foreigner and to the poor. And verses 9 through 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap to the very edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You must not strip your vineyard bare or gather its fallen grapes. Leave them for the poor and the foreign resident. I am Yahweh your God. We can jump to chapter 23. When you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap all the way to the edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the foreign resident. I am Yahweh your God. And then these are the contexts for chapter 24 of Deuteronomy. We're back in the covetous section where we get this, and it's expanded upon. So this is clarified what we just read in Leviticus. When you reap the harvest in your field and you forget a sheaf in the field, do not go back to get it. It is to be left for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you knock down the fruit from your olive tree, you must not go over the branches again. What remains will be for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you gather the grapes of your vineyard, you must not glean what is left. What remains will be for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I am commanding you to do this. So, between Leviticus 19 and 23 and Deuteronomy, we have a lot of context, but basically, these are all relating to how you take care of the poor. These are, for lack of a better phrase, these are relating to social justice. And as far as I can tell, there's nothing quite like this in any of the ancient law codes outside of Israel. So basically, you got your fields, right? And you own the family plot, the family farm, or whatever. And let's say that this right here is your family land, okay? When you go to harvest, you're not allowed to do the edge. You're not allowed to do the corners. You just leave it. And this is so the foreigners, the poor, they have somewhere they can go to gather some food for themselves. Not only that, but when you are cutting the sheaves, when you are binding them, when you are gathering everything together as part of the harvest, anything you drop, anything that is left over, you can't go back for because that stays for the land. And I think, again, this coincides very well not only with the Sabbath laws, but also the coveting laws. You're not allowed to covet everything. You have to give back. You give back to the land, you give back to the community, and you give back to Yahweh. So, Ruth is somehow aware of this. She's aware that it's some sort of custom. She's aware that this is how it's supposed to be. Maybe Naomi has told her about it because they're, not only are they women, but it's past the time to plant anything. It's too late. The harvest is already happening and they don't have any food. So in verse 2, Ruth says, can I go and collect some of these gleanings, some things that's left behind, so that we have some food? Naomi doesn't offer to go. She's bitter. She's old. She's got arthritis. I have no idea. Maybe she just wants to die. I don't know. She's like Jonah or Elijah. She's just so fed up. Just let her lay on her cot and wither away. But Ruth's like, no, it's not going to happen. I'm going to take care of you. And the only thing she knows what to do is to go and gather food from what's left over by the harvesters. And Naomi's like, whatever. Go and do what you want to do. So in verse 3, so Ruth left and entered the field to gather grain behind the harvesters. And then in verse 3, she happened to be in the portion belonging to Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. The person that we just so happened to be introduced to at the beginning of the chapter, who had absolutely nothing to do with the story. We were just being told for our own amusement, I guess. And this phrase, she happened. She happened upon this portion. Literally in the Hebrew, it befell by chance. You have this word chance, or just completely random, outside of any natural causality. Just a complete throw of the dice. And yes, I think that this is a little, the book of Ruth winking at us. So it just so happened that she wandered onto Boaz's field. And even in the Hebrew, we have this word chance. It just so completely, mystically happened by chance. So was this really random? Was it fate? Was this divine intervention? I think most of us would probably be happy with that, but could it be something else? Is this really just God works in mysterious ways? Or could it be that there's a reason that she happened to see Boaz's field? Could it be that she's wandering around and she's looking around and she notices there's this particularly nice field? It's fairly large. There's a lot of people working. There's also people gathering stuff. This is a field that is actually honoring the gleaning laws. This is one that they're actually letting poor people and foreigners collect food from. They're not running them off. They're not actually mowing down the corners so that the poor can collect. We're gonna come back to this point. But, yeah. Is it completely random, and is this just completely God inserting himself into the narrative, or is there responsibility involved on multiple people's parts? So in verse 4, later, when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to the harvesters, "The Lord be with you." They replied, "The Lord bless you." So Boaz has been in town on business or whatever, doing whatever he has to do as boss, and he's come to check on his field because he's a hand-on owner, right? He's not just leaving it to the workers. He's not an absentee boss. He wants to make sure that they're doing their jobs and motivate them as necessary. He has a vested interest in his property. And in verse 5, Boaz asked his servant, who was in charge of the harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" So Boaz, he's surveying the field, and he notices that there are probably a couple of people around collecting stuff. There are some poor, there are some kids scavenging or whatever, the usual lot. And there's someone out of place, someone who shouldn't be there. I like the C.S. Lewis phrase, "He was undone." So this is as good a time as any, because it provides some context. Ruth is probably in her early to mid-20s. Boaz, we will get hints at his age. He is definitely older than 30, and he's probably around 40 at the youngest. He's an older guy, and the traditions have always said that he's an older guy. This becomes an issue, and there are hints that he is definitely older. So in verse 7 and verse 6, the servant answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the land of Moab." So in verse 7, she asked, "Will you let me gather fallen grain among the bundles behind the harvesters? She came and has remained from early morning until now, except that she rested a little in the shelter." So we get a glimpse into Ruth right now, because he's asking about her. He's just in a general sense, who is this person? And the answer is, well, she's the foreigner, she's been with Naomi, and we get this little bit of information. She's been here all day. Well, why is that important? Because it's providing context that she didn't just come and get a little for herself, right? She's getting a lot of food, because it's not just for her. She has to get food for Naomi as well. And this seems to confirm that she is concerned for Naomi. She wants to get enough food to make sure that Naomi is going to be taken care of. Verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, did I lose something? I don't think so. So in verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay close to my female servants." So this naturally invites the question, why? Why is he so concerned that she might wander off? Well, there's probably a couple of reasons. First off, she's a foreign woman. And if she goes wandering into the wrong field, bad things could happen to her. He wants to make sure that she's taken care of. Also, as we know, he's related to Naomi, and he knows that Ruth is helping take care of Naomi, and he wants to make sure that she's provided for so that Naomi's going to be provided for. And he also not only does he warn her, don't wander off into other fields, but stay near the other women. Because again, even in my field, you don't want to go wandering off with the guys, because bad things can happen, right? In verse 9, see which field they are harvesting and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you? So again, don't go wandering off with the men, because Boaz knows bad things can happen. So in verse 8, then Boaz said to Ruth, listen. In verse 9, he goes, when you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled. I always think this verse is kind of funny because I just pictured there's like these drinking stations outside the field where maybe there's an awning or whatever, and so there's like a resting station that the guys can go and take a break and recuperate or whatever, because this is hot, long day. My personal opinion is that this is supposed to give us another glimpse into Boaz, that he is considerate towards his workers. He doesn't work them to death, that he lets them take breaks, he lets them have water, that he looks out for them. And he's giving Ruth privileges that he probably wouldn't normally give to the poor scavengers that are just picking up stuff from the border of his property. So then in verse 10, I must not be there yet. So in verse 10, she bowed with her face to the ground and said to him, why are you so kind to notice me, although I am a foreigner? This is actually a really good question, because she doesn't know why he's so keen on her and why he's taking such an interest in her, right? Because he hasn't revealed his intentions yet. And it's easy to assume that she's thinking the worst. Maybe he's got ulterior motives. Literally, in the Hebrew, she says, and it's a little convoluted, but it's, why have I found grace in your eyes to the point that you would notice me? And again, she's wanting to understand, is there any sort of reciprocity expected, or is there going to be any I can't think of the word. Favors. Is there going to, demands, any expectations on her part? So she uses this phrase, to find grace in the eyes of. And this is an expression we see pretty common throughout the Old Testament. And I'm going to make a connection. I've made this point before, but there's a difference between grace and mercy. And it's clear this in the Old Testament. So mercy is when you deserve something bad. You deserve punishment, right? You have broken the law, you've angered the king or whatever, and you deserve a judgment. You deserve to be punished. But the king, in turn, gives you something good. So he reprieves you, he pardons you, or whatever. And in Hebrew, this is rechem. It's usually translated as mercy, sometimes it's translated as compassion. But then you have the word chen. This is a completely different word. And this is the word grace. And this is the idea of being given something that you don't deserve, but you don't necessarily not deserve it. So the best example I could think of, just off the top of my head, was when we give presents like at Christmas. The problem, though, is with Christmas, as an example, is we get to a point now that it's a holiday with certain obligations. You give a present, they give you a present back, and it's this whole ordeal. So I'm thinking of St. Nicholas, right? So in the legends of St. Nicholas, who was a real person, he famously, there was a winter and things were bad, and so he went around breaking into the houses of poor people, which you normally wouldn't want to do. But he broke into their houses, and he left behind some money, he left some food, and he'd leave toys for the children. And he went through all the houses in the community, just breaking into people's houses to do that. And of course, they got through the winter, and it became a very famous story throughout the land, and he's now become an example of Christian charity. So in this expression, right, to find grace in the eyes of, the first time we see it used is actually of Noah. So the idea is God is surveying the creation, and all he sees is wicked people and people doing violence and all these horrible things. And then, as he's looking over, his eye catches one particular person, just kind of zooms in, and he sees Noah. This is used of Abraham's servant. It's used of Jacob. Very famously, it's used of Joseph, particularly of Potiphar. So Joseph, when he's brought into Egypt, Potiphar sees him, and he finds grace in Potiphar's eyes, and Potiphar buys him. It's then used again of the warden when Joseph's in prison. He's just a prisoner, and the warden sees Joseph. Joseph finds favor, and then he's elevated. He actually starts running the prison, which is kind of funny to think about. And then it's used again of Joseph when Pharaoh sees him. And then, of course, it's used of Moses, where, particularly of Moses asks Yahweh, "What have I done that I would find favor?" In a very way that using language that's very similar of what Ruth asks of Boaz. So, when we talk about Ruth, has she done anything that deserves Boaz's attention? Well, going off of the examples that I just went through, we can see that the contexts are quite different. So with Noah, for example, well, Noah was a righteous person. So that's why he stood out. God noticed him because he was righteous. If Noah wasn't righteous, then he would have been just like everybody else, and God wouldn't pay attention to him. But then we have Moses. So Moses caught the eye of Pharaoh's daughter, and actually says, because he was beautiful. So there was something about Noah, or about Moses, that garnered the attention. And then with Joseph, it actually says God was the one who directed the attention. So we actually have three completely different contexts. Noah seemingly earned it to some degree. He was a righteous person. Moses was just innate. He was just a beautiful baby, and Pharaoh's daughter took pity on him. And Joseph, however, was seemingly supernaturally involved, right? Yahweh injected himself into the situation to make sure that Potiphar would pay attention to Joseph. So when Ruth asks the question of Boaz, has she earned it? Is it that he's talking to the people and he finds out that she's the one who's taking care of Naomi, and that's why he's interested in her? Well, this is someone who's done something worthwhile, and now he's interested. Is it innate? Is it just that she's pretty? We're going to find out she is very, very pretty. We haven't been told that yet. We can kind of guess, but he lets us know. She's a very beautiful woman. Or is it something else? Could it be that, like Joseph, God just wanted Boaz to notice her? And now that he's seen her, now that she has come into his attention, he can't get her out of his head. Verse 11 may give us a little bit of context, but doesn't completely answer the question. So in verse 11, Boaz answered her and said, "Everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me, how you left your father and mother and the land of your birth, and how you came to a people you didn't previously know." This is interesting, right? Because at least as the story's been conveyed to us, the workers didn't tell him all of this. The impression seems to be that Boaz has already looked into Naomi. Boaz already knows that Naomi's returned from Moab. Boaz already knows that her husband was dead. He already knows that her kids are dead. And he was already told that she brought this Moabite with her. He didn't know who the Moabite was. He didn't know what she looked like. He knew nothing about her other than the fact that Naomi came back. She went with her family and came back with this Moabite woman. And it's not until he comes to the field this day and he's like, who's that strange woman out in the field? And someone goes, "Oh, that's the woman that's living with Naomi." And now everything's clicking for Boaz. Like, oh, okay. So he already knew this information, it seems. This gives us more information on Boaz, that he's been proactive, that he's already interested in Naomi, and that he's already interested in what's going on. This is, I think, very important information. Without being told directly, we get a pretty interesting picture of Boaz. We know that he has a large field. We know that he has a lot of employees. He seems to take care of his employees, although we know that he's a hands-on manager. We know that he allows for the gleaning of his fields. He allows the poor and the foreigners to come, otherwise Ruth wouldn't be allowed there. And we know that he's checking up on the family. When we get to chapter 3, we find out that he's done more than a little checking up. He's done a lot of checking up on Naomi. So in verse 12, "May the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." Here we have Boaz actually giving a blessing to Ruth, which, while not necessarily explicitly mandated, it is more or less encouraged, such as with Leviticus 19. "When the foreigner lives with you in the land, you must not oppress him. You must regard the foreigner who lives with you as the native among you. You are to love him as yourself, for you are foreigners in the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God." In both Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it's very clear that you are to care for the foreigner and not oppress them, not take advantage of them, and just as Yahweh blesses you, you have to bless them. And so here we have Boaz actually bestowing a direct blessing upon Ruth. And so then Ruth, in response, says, "My Lord, you have been so kind to me, for you have comforted and encouraged your slave, although I am not like one of your female servants." So she uses different words here, which is why the Holman translates them differently. So there is a word for female servant. The word she uses is a much more, not necessarily derogatory word, but it's a much more humbling word. It's basically a slave. She uses the shechat word, which is not what you would normally use for just a female worker or someone who just works on the property or works in the house. And then in verse 14, things escalate rather quickly. So in verse 14, "At mealtime, Boaz told her, 'Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the vinegar sauce.' So she sat beside the harvesters, and he offered her roasted grain. She ate and was satisfied and had some left over." So we went from her being just some random woman who's picking up pieces of barley, wheat, whatever, in the field with the other destitutes, deplorables, and all of a sudden now she's eating with the workers, as if she's one of the household. Now, we're going to be told why he's allowed this, but he's clearly extending favors to her that he would not normally extend to just some random person who wandered onto the property. So in verse 15, "When she got up to gather grain, Boaz ordered his young men, 'Let her even gather among the bundles and don't humiliate her.'" So where you're still gathering, where you're still bundling up the wheat or the barley, where you're still working, let her go and wander and take what she wants. Do not, don't interact with her, don't rebuke her, don't chastise her, whatever. And this word can't have a sexual connotation. So this could be laying down the law again. You're not allowed to do anything to her. Just leave her alone, let her do what she wants to do. So then in verse 16, "Pull out some stalks from the bundle for her and leave them for her to gather. Don't rebuke her." So not only have we gone from letting her on the property, and I don't know if this all happened in one day. It's presented like it is, but it seems like this is escalating very, very quickly. We went from her being allowed on the property to letting her wander around where the workers are and the harvesters, to letting her into the areas where they're still currently working, to, okay, as you're bundling the wheat, be sure you don't bundle it too carefully. Let stuff fall, intentionally, miss stuff, so that there's plenty for her to take, for her to gather. And again, he knows that she's gathering not just for herself, she's also gathering for Naomi. So Ruth gathered grain in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gathered, and it was about 26 quarts of barley. So that's about 6.5 gallons. That's a lot of wheat, right? This is after all the stalks are gone. This is just what she actually has left. She picked up the grain, I would imagine to be somewhat heavy, and went into the town where her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. Then she brought out what she had left over from her meal and gave it to her. So not only was she allowed to eat with the workers and eat with the family, but she was allowed to take what was left with her. I don't even know what that would look like. Like Boaz just gives her a doggy bag as she's going out the door or leaving the tent or whatever. And of course, he put food aside for Naomi. Like that's what this is. Like he knew she was going back to Naomi, and he wanted to make sure that she would have food that she could take to Naomi. So in verse 19, then her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you gather barley today, and where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." So we find out that Naomi's a pretty shrewd old woman. And we get more insight into Ruth as well, but we're told, we get a lot of hints that Naomi's been around the block, and she's pretty fast on the uptick. And so she sees Ruth, and she's got just all of this food, right? She got over 6 gallons of food that she's just lugging behind her. And not only that, but she's got this care package or whatever as well. And Naomi has no idea what to make of this. Like, how would you get all this stuff? You know, when Ruth left that morning, she probably figured she'd wander onto some field. Maybe she'd get run off a few times, but she finally found a place that let her just grab a few handfuls of food, and she'd come back, and they'd have maybe enough food for the day or the next couple of days. But she's got all this stuff, and she knows that there's no way she just got this on her own, just scavenging what's left behind. Like, she wouldn't have all of this unless someone let her have all of this. So then in verse 19, Ruth told her mother-in-law, Naomi, about the men she had worked with and said, as if just to let the name drop, like as if she doesn't know it's significant. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz." The impression being she doesn't know that Boaz is anything special. She doesn't know other than that he's just a kind farmer. So then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living or the dead." Naomi continued, "The man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers." So Ruth drops the name. It's like, I was helped by this guy named Boaz. And Naomi is just immediately knocked over because she knows who Boaz is. Boaz is one of Elimelech's family members. And not just a member of the clan or whatever, he's a close family member. Close enough to be considered one of these family redeemers. We'll get to what that means. And here she says the first positive thing she has to say about Yahweh, which is kind of funny. She says, "Blessed or praise be to Yahweh, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living or the dead." This is a pretty big reversal for Naomi, who just last chapter was cursing Yahweh to all the other women of the village. And again, it's almost like Naomi seems to be aware that there's more going on than just Ruth wandering into some random field. Yahweh has become involved. So when she talks about the kinsman redeemer, this is in Hebrew the Goel. And there's a couple of verses that talk about this, but the most famous, of course, is Leviticus 25. "So if your brother becomes destitute and sells part of his property, his nearest relative may come and redeem what his brother has sold. If a man has no family redeemer, but he prospers and obtains enough to redeem his land, he may calculate the years since its sale, repay the balance to the man he sold it to, and return to his property. But if he cannot obtain enough to repay him, what he sold will remain in the possession of its purchaser until the year of Jubilee. It is to be released at the Jubilee so that he may return to his property." So basically, this is involving property, but the kinsman redeemer is the nearest male relative. And if something happens to the family where the family is left in a particularly dire situation, it is the kinsman redeemer's obligation to take care of the family, whether it's financial straits or some sort of, it can be a number of problems. Here we have multiple problems with Naomi. We have an issue with not only the property, Elimelech's property, but also the fact that she doesn't have any kids, so there's no one to inherit the property. But also, it's the kinsman redeemer's obligation if there's a murder, right? So it's his job to catch the murderer. So a lot's going on. So Boaz is close. Boaz is not some distant relative, right? He is close enough that he has obligations to Elimelech. He's on first reading, we might assume he's a brother, but we're going to find out he's not a brother because there's someone closer, which the only thing that would be closer in my mind would be a brother. So he's close enough to have obligations. We'll return to this, but my opinion, he's probably a cousin. So close enough to have obligations, but not close enough that it's his right to step in. Right? He hasn't stepped in yet because he's not the closest living relative. And that's going to be explained in the next chapter as well. So in verse 21, Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also told me, 'Stay with my young men until they have finished all of the harvest.'" So not only is she allowed, has he given her all this food, but he's like, "Oh, by the way, feel free to come back as long as you want until the harvest is over." So when they showed up, it's the beginning of the harvest, so it's probably in April, mid to late April. She's allowed on the property to be around the men, to collect food, to do whatever, until about mid to late November. So they're going to be cared for. Verse 22. So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, "My daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants, so that nothing will happen to you in another field." This should almost go without saying, but she's like, don't go wandering into other fields. You're a foreigner, you're an attractive woman, you wander onto the wrong field and you may not come back, right? As we know, this is during the time of the judges, where there's a lot of bad stuff going on. And you have found not only a good field where there are honest people working, people who seem to follow the law, follow Torah, but a field owned by someone who's related to us and who has already extended his protection to you. So just do what he says. So in verse 23, Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So not only is she collecting food, not only is she working, but she's also staying with Naomi and caring for her. So that's pretty much it for chapter 2. The only thing that I was kind of thinking about, and this is just sort of question to end on, but it's curious to me because I'm also teaching that class on Deuteronomy at Criswell, and that's what was funny to me is as I was preparing for the lectures, I noticed how often Ruth is brought up in the Deuteronomy commentaries as an example of what Israelite society looked like, the expectations, and how the laws were implemented on a practical level, particularly when it regards foreigners and the poor, because we just don't have a lot of context when it comes to outside of Israel, and the laws don't seem to provide for the foreigners and the poor. And something to think about. So here you have these laws about the gleaning, and you have your own property, right? Boaz owns the family field, and he sends out workers, he pays the workers, they collect the wheat, they beat out the wheat, and then they sell it or whatever. But the idea that you don't fully own that field, and you are under obligation to use it to care for the community and to care for the poor. And this is just sort of the question that I brought up in the class, and I don't really have an answer for it, but it's something to think about. I'm not really sure how that corresponds to us in today's society, because we're so capitalistically minded that what is ours to use financially, economically, and if it results in the if it results in the oppression of other people, then it's fine. Now, the response to that is some sort of Marxist communistic, well, everyone owns it, and then therefore we are obligated to care for them because it's communally shared. And I don't think that that's the right response. That's going too far in the other direction. But it seems like here there is an expectation, right, that yes, you own something, but at the same time it's not fully yours, and you have an obligation to care for other people. And going back to the idea that Boaz is a hero, and the idea that is it just completely random that Ruth wandered onto his field, or is what attracted her to his field the fact that he's someone who has done what Yahweh has asked? He's got a nice big field, he's cared for the workers, and he's allowed for the edges not to be harvested. He's allowed for the poor and the destitute to come wander onto his field. If he wasn't doing those things, would she have wandered onto his field? Would she have been allowed on the field? Probably not. So it seems like there may have been a certain amount of obligation on his part. He's already a righteous person, and that's what enabled her to walk onto his field. So something to think about as we end this chapter.
Good stuff. Very insightful. Thank you, brother. Well, let's close in prayer tonight. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this man you have gifted to teach your word. And we pray, Father, your continued blessings upon these times. And Lord, thank you for feeding us from this word. And Lord, help us to be faithful to you. Be with those who are not well and strengthen them, O Lord. And watch over us as we go now, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.